I'd like to welcome the audience to another episode of Conversations with Elan. And today, Elan is going to introduce us to the relationship between Thomas de Hartmann and Kandinsky and the way in which that affected Thomas de Hartmann's music and the future of his composition career. So, Elan, why don't you take it away?
All right. Well, the thing about Kandinsky, before I get into, I want to back up just a little bit. But the thing about Kandinsky was that he was actually the first teacher that Hartmann had. He was almost, you could almost, he wasn't really his spiritual teacher, but he was the person who awoke Hartmann to his spiritual search on a conscious level, on his, in other words, the fairy tales, which I've talked about before, that was from his childhood, and that was sort of the background of his whole modus operandi. But Kandinsky brought this all to the fore. But before we get to that, I want to begin where we left off, where I was talking about how Hartmann had finally gotten to the point where he was now famous in Russia in 1907 with the production of his ballet, The Scarlet Flower. La Fleurette Rouge was what it was actually called in French in those days. And because the Tsar was sitting in the audience watching this, Tsar Nicholas II was watching this performance, and because Hartmann had a personal connection to the Grand Duchess Olga, who was Tsar Nicholas's sister, she persuaded the Tsar to give Thomas de Hartmann a exemption, a military exemption, so that he could go study. So you have this, what I've always considered a very peculiar situation with de Hartmann, because here he is, he's risen to fame. Any sensible person would have taken advantage of this, stayed in Russia, and capitalized on his career. But no, Hartmann didn't do that. He decided he wanted to go to Munich, and because he had this to study conducting with Felix Mottl, who had been a pupil of Wagner. And so I've always considered this moment a very seminal moment for Hartmann, because it was the moment where he was so to speak, jumped off the cliff. And because at that moment when he decided that he was going to go to Munich, it accelerated his path to Gurdjieff and all the rest of the things that happened to him. It also accelerated his path towards penury, because he began, as I've indicated, he began in the aristocracy, almost unlimited wealth, and he died in difficult financial straits. And so there was a downward trajectory as a result of this. Didn't happen immediately, but it definitely did happen. And and yet the trade-off was that he got all of this spiritual information, all this information which informed not only his composing, but also for his inner life. So now, um, so he goes to Munich in 1908, and just before this time, we have a couple of quotes from Hartmann which I want to bring to your attention, because it also shows you what his state of mind was. Now, this quote is sometime between 1906 and 1908, sometime around the production of The Scarlet Flower, and sometime around probably before he actually met Kandinsky. And he says, to my surprise, I took myself to account and began to realize that all that had attracted me in my youth, all that I had dearly loved in music, no longer satisfied me and was, so to say, outdated. So this is a very interesting statement that he's making. He's rejecting all of this great romantic music that he had composed up to this time, and was beginning to look for something else in his musical work, in his creative work. And and as an aside, I would just want to put this in there. right now, at this very moment, I am working to record another CD of Thomas de Hartmann's music. And this CD will include at least three pieces. One of them is going to be his very first piano sonata, Opus 2. Then his very last piano pieces, the four serenades. And in between, we're going to include a chamber music piece. I'm not going to be playing in this, but it's going to be the Danse Plastique, which was a piece that came from the Kandinsky era, that the time when he was with Kandinsky in Munich. And what's interesting about this is that this first piano sonata, it's a 25-page piece. It's at least 20 minutes long. It's the largest piece of piano solo music that he wrote until the 1940s, until 1947. And it's a large-scale romantic work. And he never published it. As a matter of fact, there are all kinds of errors in this. Key signatures, missing out on accidentals. I mean, just an extraordinary number of errors in order to get that piece of music ready for performance has been quite, it's been quite a journey to figure out what he actually meant. And we know that Hartmann made a lot of mistakes. He was very careless when he was young, when he was writing. He made so many different kinds of mistakes in his notation, but still, there's even more than usual. And in 1947, when he composed his next piano sonata, he called it his first piano sonata. So what's going on there? It's always seemed to me that this statement that he has, this disillusionment with what he with what he had produced up to this point, may have been indicated in the fact that he never did bother to publish this sonata, that he was already ready to move on and do other things. In any event, he arrives in Munich and he goes to study with Felix Mottl, and he studies with him, and not only that, he is given opportunities to conduct when Felix Mottl is indisposed. Several times he conducted the orchestra, and he was also allowed to play in the orchestra. And he says that he played percussion in the orchestra, and this gave him the opportunity to find out about how the orchestra works from a very personal standpoint. And again, just as a slight aside, it's interesting to note that when he began composing in the 1940s, he composed his great orchestral works, his concerti, his symphonic poems, and various orchestral suites. Almost every one of those orchestral pieces has a piano in the orchestra playing, which is a very unusual phenomenon for symphonies to be. I mean, sure, occasionally, yes, but not so consistently as what Hartmann did. Now, all that said, we have another statement by Thomas de Hartmann that I want to read to you because it's indicative of where he was internally at this time. As soon as he got to Munich, he became disillusioned with the musical situation. And he says, this is a quote, "It didn't take me long to feel strongly that although all concerts were of a high standard of performance, music in Germany had reached an impasse. The 4 Bs reigned," and I assume that these 4 Bs are Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and Berlioz. And continuing to quote, "And Wagner's warning, children, knew and knew and knew and always knew. Otherwise, the devil of unproductivity will take you," had been forgotten. It seemed clear to me that new forms and techniques had to be found, and more than anything else, I wished to find my own way. Soon, I found it through painting. So there we are. he begins to get he's disillusioned with the musical situation in Munich, and he turns to visual art. And this goes back, in my understanding, this goes back to Victor Hartmann, his great uncle, who was the artist who painted the paintings for the pictures of at an exhibition of Mussorgsky. So at this point, he is introduced to the paintings of Gauguin, of Cézanne, of Matisse, and then he meets Kandinsky. And I need to read to you something about that. Just let me see if I can find it. Okay, I'll just give you this quote. It's not as easy to read as I had hoped, but here we are. He says, I remember, so he first met Kandinsky at some occasion, but they didn't really have a chance to talk. But then he says, I remember soon after this first meeting, a hot summer day, when I met Kandinsky unexpectedly near Munich's Arch of Triumph. He jumped from his bicycle, and we began to speak about our common interests, such as theater, ballet, and metaphysics. We decided to meet the very same evening to continue our talk. This was the beginning of our great friendship, which lasted until his death. And it seems interesting to me that shortly after this, they discovered that they were living on the same block in Munich. And so they began to meet every night. So they had a very, they became the closest of friends. So here we are at this point of his meeting Kandinsky. And at this point, I want to go back and give you some kind of an introduction, not, a scholarly introduction. That's not possible for me. But I want to give you an introduction to who Kandinsky was and what Kandinsky was up to at the time that he met Thomas de Hartmann before we continue in this story. So Kandinsky, born in 1866, he's 18 years older than de Hartmann. And you could say, we know, as I mentioned in a previous episode, that de Hartmann's father died when Hartmann was 9 or 10 years old, depending upon how the catalog says the date of his birth was. But when he was very young, his father dies. And then he goes to study with Arensky, the composer Arensky, and he's with Arensky for 10 years. It seems quite likely that Arensky becomes a father figure for him. And now he's meeting Kandinsky. And Kandinsky, 18 years old, becomes also his guide. He becomes almost a father figure for de Hartmann. And we'll go into that in a little later. But so Kandinsky, born in 1866, has, at the age of 5, he begins to study musical instruments. He's a cellist and he's a gifted pianist, both those instruments. And what's even more important is that he has what's called synesthesia. So when he hears music, when he hears sounds, he sees colors. When he sees colors, he hears sounds. So already from his very, very, very earliest childhood, he is aware of the interconnectivity between these two art forms of music and painting. But Kandinsky, as a young man, goes into law. He studies law and he is embarking on a career in teaching law and economics. And it is not until he's 30 years old that he begins work as a painter. And this is the most interesting impulsion for him was when in 1896, when he saw an exhibition of Monet's paintings. And he saw a picture of one of Monet's many haystacks. Okay, and you can, if you don't know about these paintings, you can look them up online and you'll see these paintings of these haystacks. And here's what Kandinsky says about the haystacks. He says, that it was a haystack, the catalog informed me. I could not recognize it. This non-recognition was painful to me. I considered the painter had no right to paint indistinctly. I dully felt that the object of the painting was missing. But I noticed with surprise and confusion that the picture not only surprised me, that the picture not only gripped me, but impressed itself indelibly on my memory. Painting took on a fairy tale power and splendor. So this was the moment that he decided that he was going to become a painter, and it was also the moment where he saw that it was the first point where he saw the need to go into abstraction, because he saw that there was something in that painting more than the form, more than the actual picture of the haystack. There was something underlying that picture of the haystack, which was represented by this light, this spiritual quality that was in this painting that attracted him. And this was the beginning of his movement towards abstraction. So now we're back. Now we can move back, I think. Let me just see. I think we can move back to... Yes. I think we can move back to the story with Thomas de Hartmann. So Hartmann arrives. That was, as I said, that was 1896. And Kandinsky studies painting, and he begins to go slowly into abstraction. And by the time Hartmann meets him in 1908, he is doing these paintings of such things. He's still painting forms. And there's a very interesting story. There's one of the things that Hartmann mentions is a painting of it's called The Houses. And there's a street of these houses in a little town, in a little village, and that Kandinsky is painting each of these houses very, very strange colors. In other words, these colors are not found on houses. And what he is trying to do is he's trying to express an inner quality that each of these houses has that he wants to bring out. And so this was one of the beginning. So this was the beginning of his work with abstraction, to get beneath the surface of these forms. And Hartmann also describes him watching him working with the woodcuts, which also, and so that Kandinsky could make just like a single line to express something, to express a deeper meaning in what he is trying to communicate. So now we have this situation where Hartmann arrives, and they are very in sync. The two of them are very in sync in their aims, although Kandinsky is far, far ahead. Kandinsky has all these ideas about the interconnectivity between the art forms, and as I said, about going towards abstraction. And Hartmann is just fascinated by the vision that Kandinsky has. And they begin to work together. They begin to collaborate. And the first thing that they do is they begin work. Hartmann wants to compose music for one of Andersen's fairy tales, and Kandinsky makes the scenario, the painting for this, as far as I understand, they actually completed this project, but the music and the painting were lost during the World War I. But they did a number of different experiments with interconnectivity between painting and music. And then at a certain point, this dancer appeared. And this was Sakharov. I've mentioned Sakharov before. Sakharov is the one who said, in relation to dance, that I don't dance to the music, I dance the music. And he also was he was a trained ballet dancer who rejected ballet and went, and in many ways he's considered the first modern dancer. And what he would do is he would go into museums and he would look at the Grecian urns and he would see these paintings of the Greek dances, and he would imitate those gestures, and he was trying to get also in his own way to get back to this point of a deeper meaning through gesture. That was what he was looking for. And so Sakharov joins this group with Kandinsky and Thomas de Hartmann, and they begin having what can only be described as jam sessions. So Kandinsky is sitting there shouting out storylines, scene lines, and Hartmann is improvising the music, and Sakharov is improvising the dance. And they had many of these dance sessions. They were quite well known in Munich. There was quite a lot of buzz around what the three of them were doing in terms of this artistic kind of ferment that was very, very new at that time. And they then began to work at various productions. They wanted to compose something that was going to be what the Germans called the Gesamtkunstwerk, a complete work of art which incorporated multimedia. And the first big thing that they tried to do was to do the legend of the myth of Daphnis and Chloe. And they were working on that when they found out that Diaghilev, the impresario, was working with Ravel to compose a dance, a ballet on the same subject matter. So they abandoned that, and gradually they came to the choice of working on this incredible project, which was called Der Gelbe Klang, the yellow sound. And this has been described in different kinds of ways, and one of the ways is that it's called an abstract opera. So that, in other words, they were trying to get, as Kandinsky had been doing with his painting, to get beyond form. So they had a scenario. They had what would you call it? The script. The script for this was really a plotless script, and the paintings were these abstract paintings of these giant yellow giants. And Hartmann was composing. He only composed a sketch for this because they were looking for a theater of particular dimensions, of particular acoustic, and Hartmann was not going to start composing the actual music for this until he had the place in mind that he was going to compose for. And at the same time, nobody would take up this project. He brought this idea to the Moscow Arts Theater, and the response was, we would never do such a mad thing. So it was so far ahead of its time that it was never produced in Hartmann's lifetime. although even in the 1940s we have written material by de Hartmann hoping that this was going to actually come to fruition. Um, in any event, I want before I go on with the yellow sound story, because that takes us straight into the 1950s and to the 1980s and beyond. I just want to read something to you about what Hartmann was actually, and what they were actually trying. This is not Hartmann, and also Kandinsky and Sakharov were trying to do, because I think it will be very interesting, especially to people who are following their own spiritual path, involved with this teaching of Gurdjieff. And this is what Hartmann said when he was trying to communicate to people what they were actually about. Okay? And he says this, and we can try this ourselves now. Concentrate and pronounce several times yellow sound, yellow sound, yellow sound, yellow sound. And you will see that in a few seconds, color will sound, and the sound will become yellow. Together, they will give a quite new experience to the listener. They will allow one to see with other ears and other eyes, and will give birth within himself to a third, much more important inner sound, which was what Kandinsky and I always spoke about. All right. Now, before I go on to talk about, I think I'm going to leave off for today because of the time constraint, and we'll pick up. I wanted to finish talking about the yellow sound and also other aspects of the story of Kandinsky when we take up the next time. But since we've begun a process of actually playing a little bit of music at the end of each episode, I thought today it would be interesting for you to hear the three very short little preludes that Hartmann wrote. As a matter of fact, well, depending upon how much time we have, because there's things to say about these preludes, maybe I play you the first prelude, and I will say a little something about it, and then if we have time, we'll do the other one and the third, okay? They're very short. These preludes, by the way, to my ears, show a definite progression from Hartmann's early romanticism towards his modernistic sound that have gradually evolved during his later years. But they are still very, very romantic sounding, and there is a big question about when they were actually composed, because it says on Madame de Hartmann's thing that they were composed in 1904 and that they were Opus 9. Well, Opus 9 is impossible because Opus 9 was the Fleurette Rouge, and we now think it was Fleurette Rouge 1907, by the way. So, we now see that the Opus number is Opus 11. So if it's after 1907, this places it at the beginning of the Kandinsky collaboration between Hartmann and Kandinsky, which I find much more reasonable to expect to be true. Anyway, these three preludes are very short, but they're very experimental. And the first one that I'm going to play for you now is, in one page, he changes time signature. In other words, he changes the rhythm 12 times. He has to put it. So that's one of the aspects of this first prelude. And I'll just say the second prelude has all kinds of ambiguity about what key he's in. He's playing games which as to what key you're in. And the third one has all kinds of very interesting divisions of the beat. These things probably take more time than we have today to talk about, but I play you this first prelude. All right.
I didn't notice time signature changes. The piece seemed to flow quite beautifully.
It flows quite beautifully, but since you asked, I will just show you. The first bar is in 3/2 time. 1, 2, 3. The second bar is in 3/4 time. 1, 2, 3. Second in the two following bars, the same pattern. Then there's a 7/4 bar. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven. So yes, it flows beautifully. It sounds very romantic, but yes, it's got all these different time signatures in there.
Interesting. Cool. Well, Elan, I thank you. I, for one, was unaware of Hartmann's interest in art and his association with Kandinsky, who was, of course, formidable. Um, and the way that it influenced his interest in structure and abstraction is fascinating to me, anyway. It
Yes,
was a
and
very rich period in terms of exploration.
I should mention that right now in New York, for the next few months, there is an exhibition of Gabriel Munter's paintings at the Guggenheim Museum, and that Gabrielle Munter was the companion of Kandinsky. She was part of the Blaureiter group. So if people are interested in seeing that, this is an opportunity.
Cool. I thank you. We'll be reconvening again next Friday for another episode, at which point you will introduce us to the other preludes. And maybe we could start with that because
Oh,
they are preludes after all.
okay.
All
Good.
right. We'll see you then.